Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session titled UNGC-UNFCCC Joint Session, Way Forward on the NDCs and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement with the Private Sector. I would like to invite our moderator for today, Ms. Juhi Bansal, Regional Expert for NDCs and LT-LED's UNFCCC's IGES Regional Collaboration Center for Asia and the Pacific.
Thank you so much. Now for the next panel, I would like to invite Ms. Victoria Tan, the Executive Director from the Group Risk Management and Sustainability Unit from the Ayala Corporation. I would also like to invite Ms. Anir Mandir, the Chief Human Capital and Sustainability Officer from Sri Ramakrishna Exports Private Limited, and Mr. Ravi Fernando, the Board Director and Board Member from the UN Global Compact Network, Sri Lanka. Please join me here. You guys can. Thank you so much. You can be in the center. Thank you very much. I think what Mr. Farid shared with us really sets the context for what businesses can do in supporting governments. And we do understand that there have to be regulatory mechanisms and certain frameworks in place from the governmental NDCs to give the right direction. But now moving on to the more private sector perspective, I would first like to pose my question, I think, to Vicky. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here today. But I just wanted to ask you that in terms of a private sector perspective, based on your experience, what are the characteristics of investable NDCs? What do you see as being there in an NDC that would make it investable from a private sector perspective? But also just to ask from your experience in the Philippines, how the Ayala Corporation is supporting Philippines in its NDC.
Okay, so probably I will take it from the investor's lens. So if I will be the one to invest in an NDC, what will be the characteristic? First of all, I would like to see a sectoral pathways with granular data or granular strategy on how are they going to decarbonize the pathways, but also setting into context what is the country perspectives. Like, for example, what is the energy mix in the country and what is the expected foreign direct investment. The other one is probably it will help if the NDC will also quantify the investment needs and what are the financing strategies alongside those NDCs, like if we can quantify what is the cost of transition, the sources of finance, and the financial instruments. Because if I am the investor, I would like also to see some skin in the game. It will not be all loans, but there will be some equity from the part of the owner or the developer. And the other one is set out supporting policy and regulatory frameworks, which I guess our Mr. From Malaysia also mentioned about that enabling environment, so that it actually sets the NDC targets. It will give confidence and trust that the decarbonization plan is actually credible. And just now, just when we have just completed the first half of the session, I just received a note from my colleagues in the Philippines that the LCE bill, or the Low Carbon Economy Bill for the Philippines, has just been passed. And we have been working with that with the Congress, the lower house, for the last how many months. And we have done a lot of improvements after some stakeholder engagement. And I guess that bill will actually define what will be the NDC targets for the country, including the strengthening of the GHG inventory, the NICDIS, the Article 6, what is the carbon pricing mechanism, and how are we going to monitor everything in relation to the Low Carbon Economy Bill, which is really part of that Paris Agreement. The other one is to strengthen governance and the stakeholder engagement process around NDC, and that will actually ensure that there is transparency and accountability, and it will actually open dialogues on how we can improve these NDCs. Because as you mentioned, this has to be reviewed every 5 years, so this is not something cast in stones. Anything any development in technology will also help us in that NDC formulation. And the last one is enhance global harmonization and consistency across NDCs to facilitate the collection and analysis of consistent information. And that will actually also inform the decision-making process. And another thing in that area is that we have to align with the national adaptation plan of the country and the NDCIP, or the Nationally Determined Contribution Implementation Plan. The Philippines has actually submitted these plans last May in the UNFCCC. But another trivia probably is that among all the ASEAN countries, only the Philippines do not have the pledge to commit to net zero. So all the other 9 companies, they have pledged by way of policy document or just open pledges in the UNFCCC. Even Laos have their commitment, except for the Philippines. But we actually have developed our NDC, which is like reduction of 75% at a baseline by 2030. 2% is unconditional, and the rest is everything is conditional. So that's something that we have to improve as a country. Now, on the part of the Ayala Corporation, we have actually committed to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2050 in October 2021. My senior management team said that it is a leap of faith because we really don't know how to do it. But I guess it takes courageous leadership to say that we will be doing this, and we don't know whether we will be successful, but I guess putting your neck on the line is something that we espouse, because this is not only for us, but the future generations of the Filipinos. So from 2021 to today, most of our publicly listed companies, they have come up with their net zero decarbonization plan by 2050. Globe Telecom has actually submitted to SBTI, and that is the first Filipino company with an SBTI validated target. So they have set up their plans up to 2050. Another one in the company portfolio is the real estate company. They also applied for SBTI, and they're just waiting for the time that SBTI will come back to them and will tell them, oh, it's time to be validated. Our ASEN, our renewable energy platform, it is the biggest or the largest in Southeast Asia. And so sometime in 2018, we made a decision to reduce our exposure to coal, and so we actually started doing these renewable energy investments, and one probably innovative way of reducing the coal exposure is through the energy transition mechanism, and this one is a product of Asian Development Bank, and we were able to implement that in the Philippines, and that is actually the first global ETM in the world. And right now, we are talking to the Monetary Authority of Singapore about the transition credits. So we will be shutting down the coal 10 years ahead, and for that, there will be avoided emissions, and that will be part of the transition credits. We are now working with our bank company, which is the oldest bank in the Philippines, on how we can help on this transition and in the financing side. So I guess that's the most challenge part of the portfolio, because I guess everyone knows that 99.9% of their emission will be coming from Scope 3. And for the parent company, it took us 2 years to understand what is our GHG baseline. So we have disclosed our GHG baseline, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 last April 2024, and that actually encompassed all the things that we have done from 2021, 2022, and 2023. But that is the data for 2021. So the team the team is now working to update it up to 2024, and after that, we will come up with our own net zero roadmap as the parent company. That's on the Ayala side. Now, part of my work also within the group is to engage with the lawmakers, because we have to make sure that everything that we do, and we are part of the risk management, is anticipating transition risk coming from the regulator. And so we engage with the regulator and ask them and the lawmakers, how are you doing with all of these climate issues? Is there any bill that we can give our inputs or things that you want to hear from us as the private sector? And so that's the bill that I mentioned a while ago. So after so many months of working with them, we have come up with the low carbon economy, or we call it now the Low Carbon Investment Act for the country. I think that's it.
So incredible to hear. Thank you so much, Victoria. I think this is impressive. I do understand that it's a challenge for companies to pledge something that they don't know how to embark upon. But the fact that you commit, then you find ways, you know? And even if you fall short of the target and fail, it's still failing better. You're doing better than so many others that are not taking the risk and giving those commitments. So thank you for that. I think leading in from this, now that you've mentioned the SBTIs, I think it would be great now to direct the next question to Nirav. Just asking that, you know, as mentioned, clear sectoral targets will be key in delivering the decarbonization goals that are mentioned by countries in their NDCs. Now, based on your experience, I know with the, the Energy and Climate Task Force, but also with your company, how can businesses support these sectoral transitions, and how has your company done the same?
Thank you very much, Juhi. First of all, thank you very much for having me. And I completely echo to the words of Victoria, what she mentioned about. So there are two perspectives to it. When we talk about the NDC, and someone has very rightly mentioned that to have the societal change, we should be having both optimist and the pessimist people in the society. Because the optimist part is like when UNGC is having a collaboration with UNFCCC to have the talk about the role of a private sector into the NDC. At the other end, the pessimist part, I'm not sure how many of you are aware that last Tuesday, UN released a report that even if all the countries who have submitted their target for NDC is going to match that target by the timeline, then after it would be a threshold breach of 1.5 degree commitment. So that's the pessimist part. Then why we are having this conversation? So that might be the point of the concern. But the conversation is so timely and so aptly, because we can't blame only the governments that, okay, it's the role of a government to commit the guidelines and share the guidelines and the sectoral guidelines and keep on releasing the guidelines and do the enforcement, ask the companies to do it. There are many companies, like she mentioned about the voluntary approach. Across the world, the ones who are listed companies, they do have the mandatory approach from their respective stock exchange board to mandate certain targets to match the pace with the global guidelines. But there are companies like SRK, still a private limited company. We don't have any mandate from the government of India to do the things. But even though a global corporation having a footprint globally, having the manufacturing facilities that not only the net zero manufacturing facilities, but also among the top 5 green buildings of the world certified by US Green Building Council. So which data to look at? Why the companies have to wait to asking for the guidelines from the government to mandate, and then they'll be doing it. So one should be having the proactive and kind of a volunteer approach to commit the guidelines and how they may contribute reducing the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And by saying that after attaining net zero, we applied for SBTI. So that's the thing which, like, it's like you are not stopping anywhere. You are also putting your voluntary efforts and proactive efforts to do something unique. And I think it's like and even I shared some of the data from the India as a country, because the guideline and the mandate for India as a country to be net zero is 2070. And if talk about the NDC submission of India, it's like 2016, the first submission happened when they talk about the carbon intensity with respect to the GDP of 2005, which was 30 to 35%. And then it got revised in 2022 when it became the 45%. And that's also another submission of additional carbon, these things through the forestry, which was 2.5 to 3 billion metric tons of equivalent of CO2. And that got revised. Again, it's around 3 billion. So it's all about, by adhering to the guidelines of your national mandate, how you are contributing to it, rather than asking the government to push us on in that regard. So I think that is something which is very unique. And as Juhi, you rightly mentioned, the role of a private sector into the, and this, it's a voyage, it's not an overnight journey. But I think the long-term targets for the decarbonization, and that to a sectoral targets in a long-term manner, would help the private sector to have more inclusive approach into the NDCs, and it has to be there with in conjunction with the corporate leaders. It's not like without having discussion with the corporate leaders, because the requirement, the challenges and the opportunities of each sector, even so as the carbon emissions, is different. So why, you can't mandate the same thing across all the sector, and we should be having the bifurcation of respective business nuances has to be there in mind while defining those long-term targets for the private sector. So I think this concludes the entire ecosystem while building upon, but the long way to go. And then, of course, the private sector is having a very critical role and critical play to charter this journey into the NDC. That's my take on that.
Thank you so much, Nirav. I think it's important that you mentioned that we have a closing window of opportunity. You know, this is how we like to say it. We don't like to be pessimistic or optimistic, just realists. We're saying that there is an opportunity to be captured, and I think the private sector stands at the forefront of capturing those opportunities, not just as a duty, but more even as a profit case. There are lots of business cases being made for these sectoral transitions. Indeed, we heard from Malaysia on what Petronas, for example, is doing for the energy sector and what can be done in the transport sector in the same way. So I do thank you for your intervention. I think the path doesn't stop if you do achieve net zero. You stand and do more, like apply for SBTIs and see how you can lead and support other private sector for. Yes, and we also hear that the Article 6 mechanism can play a role once you have achieved enough targets and help some of those entities that will not be able to decarbonize in time with the other commitments that are being made. Also, I think one of the important things that you mentioned is the long-term strategies, which signal a good kind of signaling to the private sector. So I think that's also where I link to Mr. Farid's intervention, that the NDCs are the 5-year, 10-year time frame. And then you have the long-term strategies that even Malaysia is preparing now to kind of indicate the consistency that could signal to the private sector that they can invest. It's a safe investing environment in the country. Now, last but not least, I think I would like to ask my question to Mr. Ravi on how can businesses work with countries to actually increase climate ambition, not just fulfilling the commitments, but going beyond in the next NDCs? And how can climate action from business help in delivering the NDCs, but also the SDGs, which are concurrent, but also go beyond. So NDCs are more mitigation-centric, but SDGs look at no one left behind along all sectors.
Okay, thank you, Juhi. I think I want to start with a comment made by the Secretary General recently. He said that the era of global warming has ended, and the era of global boiling has begun. And then to support Mirav's point, there is a report which says that we'll be crossing 1.5 by 2025. So we are sitting on a powder keg. So what I want to do is to just talk about a practical way of getting private sector involved and how we have approached it in the UNGC Sri Lanka operation. The Sri Lankan energy mix is about 30% coming from renewables and 70% coming from fossil fuels. So there's a massive job to be done. The NDC, in terms of renewable energy, is that we want to switch that from 70% coming from renewables and 30% from the fossil fuel industry by 2030. Now that's a complete reversal of the whole energy mix. So in order to do this, if we leave the whole story to the public sector to achieve that, there's no chance that it's going to achieve it, because as some of you might know, Sri Lanka has also had an economic downturn. So with an economic downturn, I think it's almost impossible for the public sector to now be the champion of this, in which case we've got to energize the private sector. So the way we have approached this is, first and foremost, get the 70 companies that are members of the UN Global Compact. And fortunately for us, that they include the biggest and the best companies. And what we have done is to first try and get the NDC story and the whole need for ratcheting up renewables into the board agenda. Because we cannot take it for granted that the private sector is going to run after the NDCs if they don't know what the NDCs are. And so what we have done, I think quite well, is to first get the private sector aligned to the NDCs. And the NDC commitment being 70%, what we have done is to sort of given a slightly higher target to the private sector and said, why don't we get to 80% in terms of the private sector? And what we did was, we first took an example of a plantation company, which is one of the biggest plantation companies, not the one that was presented this afternoon, but another one of them. And they were at about 17% renewable energy in 2016. And we pushed hard to get them to 100%. We had said by 2020. But the good news is that in 2024, we are 150%. So we made it quite factual that it can be achieved. And since then, we've been having a climate emergency task force within the UN Global Compact, where we have now set these targets for every one of the companies. And the good news is that at every quarterly review of the climate emergency task force, they are presenting the progress versus their annual targets in terms of going towards renewables. And I think we are now feeling reasonably confident that the private sector would play a key role in driving the entire renewable energy movement. And the latest figures that we are seeing now is that we've now got to about 40 to 42% renewables already. And we are looking at getting to 70% by 2030. But I think the private sector, if they can hit the 80%, we'll probably get to beyond 70%. Now, in terms of linking the NDCs and the UN SDGs, I think one of the areas that we have focused on is what are the priority SDGs? Because I think if every country tries to achieve 17 SDGs, I think you'll need a couple of more country heads and a couple of more company heads to do that. So what we have done is to prioritize what are the key UN SDGs that are relevant to the nation. And the obvious ones for us are 6 and 7, water and renewables, then 12, because sustainable consumption and production, and then 14, which is 15, which is life on land and ensuring you don't have the deforestation. So those 5 goals we have given every one of the operations that are members of the Global Compact to also focus on in terms of going after targets. So that's the game plan we are working with. And I think one cannot take it for granted that the private sector, unless totally aligned to the sustainability agenda, are waking up in the morning saying, let's hit the UN SDGs, or let's start achieving the renewables targets. So I think that one has to accept the fact that a majority of the MNCs and the private sector companies that we have, their boards are basically populated by finance people and legal people. So if you go to them and say, you know, we've got these UN SDGs, they're going to wonder what that is. So there is a certain amount of education that has to be also done with the boards, and getting the key is how do we get it to the board agenda. I think the moment you can get the climate emergency into the board agenda and start driving the renewables target, at least go for 7 and achieve something, I think then we can see some traction. And that's what we have been spending time doing in terms of getting it into the board agenda.
Thank you so much for that, Ravi. I think that is something to be echoed, given that the global stocktake outcome emphasized that we need to have doubling of renewable energy capacities and tripling of energy efficiency. If we can focus, on SDG 7 linked with the energy targets within the NDCs, because they're the biggest emitting sector, I think that would be super important. And working with all of you, I think it would be the only way to achieve these ambitious targets that countries are setting. But I have been reminded that we have only 2 to 3 minutes left on this panel. So what I will ask before I conclude is just that each of you give your one key takeaway from this conversation and from your thoughts, so we can wind up on that.
Probably that there is no competition if we are actually solving global issues. So the climate change issue is not for the future generation alone. It is for us. It is for the humanity to exist in the next, probably, cycle of this earth. So no competition if it is for the global issues.
To barge upon what you mentioned about, like, you attained it, but how you are supporting the others to attain in that journey. So I would just say that it's like the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, but it is whether we provide enough to those who have too little. That's about the support, and then that's noble journey.
Okay, I think I'm going to be a little controversial and say that if we don't solve the energy problem, solving everything else is not going to keep the global temperatures below 1.5. And I think 1.5 is increasingly becoming a pipe dream. I think we now need to at least make sure we don't cross 2. And if global warming is real, and if the energy crisis is real, then I would say the one thing I would urge every company and every country to do is get your renewables up to 100%. That's the one thing you can do to reduce an otherwise crisis.
So I completely concur with all of you. I think the main takeaway is that, even with full commitments as of now, we stand to offshoot our targets. So we need all hands on deck, collaborative approaches, and the time to act is now. So forward faster, louder, forward faster now. We work together, and we hope to support countries and work together and deliver the targets together.